Right now, you are told the story of the first war for Armageddon is about heroes. You are told the Space Wolves and Grey Knights beat back the demon Primarch Angron and saved the world. But that is not the full truth. Here is why. The victory was immediately followed by a civil war, a mass purge, and the erasure of history, leaving the world ripe for a new apocalypse. Which is why in this video, you will get the two hidden factors that truly doomed Armageddon. The Imperium's standard approach to chaos taint is simple: burn it out. But on Armageddon, they made two critical mistakes. Many people believe the Inquisition simply executed corrupted citizens or relied on memory wiping entire populations. This is risky because it creates a historical vacuum and breeds resentment, leaving the door open for new dangers. The approach revealed here needed no special equipment, only arrogance and ambition. You will get two simple truths behind the next war. We will start with the second most important factor, then reveal the single greatest threat to emerge from the ashes. These factors are effective because they attack the Imperium from both within and without. Later, you will also see three critical mistakes made by the planet's defenders that guaranteed its fall. Let us start. Factor 1. The rot from within. When you replace a hardened, veteran populace with indoctrinated settlers and place them under the command of corrupt aristocrats, you create a fatally weak society. Here is what is happening in the system. The von Strab dynasty, installed to govern the rebuilt world, was consumed by internal power struggles. A recent analysis of their 500-year reign shows a consistent pattern of assassination, neglect, and resource hoarding. For example, the ascension of Hermann von Strab was achieved by killing his own father and three brothers. Here is exactly how this rotted the planet's defenses. 1. Vital funds for the planetary defense forces were diverted to lavish feasts and personal projects. 2. Experienced military commanders were replaced with political sycophants loyal only to the von Strabs. 3. Public morale collapsed under their inept and cruel leadership. Start with this understanding. Armageddon was hollowed out from the inside for centuries. To progress, this rot would need to be met by an outside force. Remember, a fortress with a rotten core cannot stand. And that is not all, because while the rulers partied, a far greater danger was stirring in the darkness of the void. Now, let us talk about the single most important factor. Factor 2, the prophet of the Warog. When an orc survives a catastrophic head wound and is rebuilt with an adamantium skull, his latent psychic potential can be violently awakened. Here is what is happening in his mind. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka believed he was chosen by the orc gods Gork and Mork to lead a galactic war. A deep analysis of his rise on the backwater world of Urk shows a stunning strategic mind previously unseen in his species. One study of his tactics noted his ability to unite warring clans, a feat that had not been accomplished on that world for over 8,000 years. For example, he defeated one rival in a naval battle fought on a bone-dry plain, and another in a headbutting contest his new metal skull made unwinnable. Here is exactly how he built his army. 1. He challenged and defeated every rival warboss, absorbing their tribes into his own. 2. He presented his survival and visions as a divine mandate, transforming a simple war band into a holy crusade. 3. He capitalized on a dying star to force his new army to build a fleet and escape into the galaxy, perfectly timed for an invasion. Start with this prescription. Understand that Ghazghkull was not a mindless brute. To progress, he would need a target worthy of his ambition. Remember, a prophet with a holy war needs a holy land to conquer. Now, you must protect your understanding of this history by avoiding the common myths. The number one myth to avoid: that the orcs chose Armageddon by chance. Many people believe this because orcs are seen as simple creatures drawn to any good fight. The problem is this ignores the planet's secret history. Ancient records show Armageddon was once the capital of a colossal orc empire known as Anna, a world so significant the emperor himself had to lead a crusade to conquer it. For example, a heretical Mechanicus faction secretly teleported the entire planet to a new star system rather than see it destroyed, renaming it Armageddon to hide its past. Instead, understand that Ghazghkull was likely drawn to the world by a deep, psychic echo of his species' ancient glory. The number 2 myth to avoid, that Overlord von Strab was simply incompetent. This is popular because it is an easy explanation for the planet's fall. The problem is this understates the sheer, active malevolence of his leadership. Data shows his refusal to call for aid was not just ignorance, it was arrogance. For example, when the Ork Armada first appeared, a process that took a full month to cross the system, he sent no astropathic warnings and made no requests for reinforcement, believing his personal guards could handle it. Instead, see his actions as a deliberate choice to hoard glory for himself, a decision that cost billions of lives. The number 3 myth to avoid, that the initial Ork invasion was a disorganized mess. Many people believe this because Ork technology is crude and their tactics appear chaotic. The problem is this fails to recognize Ghazghkull's strategic genius. The invasion was a 5-pronged, coordinated assault. For example, while one space hulk crashed directly into Hive Euban to create a primary beachhead, other tribes were given specific instructions to sweep across the continent and capture the hives of Volcanus, Tempesta, and Death Maya simultaneously. Instead of a random landing, this was a planned decapitation strike against the planet's industrial heartlands. Here is the truth. A war is 80% preparation and 20% execution. That is why the fall of Armageddon was guaranteed long before the first Ork landed. The combination of a rotten political system and the rise of a messianic, strategic genius in an enemy commander created the perfect storm. The planet's fate was sealed by events that took place centuries before, in the dark chambers of the Inquisition and on the bloody sands of a forgotten world. This story is a lesson in how arrogance and ambition can doom a world twice over. Tomorrow, there will be a video that reveals the one man who saw it all coming. It covers the story of an aging commissar who defied his corrupt masters and became the planet's last, best hope. You must subscribe and turn on all notifications so you do not miss it. Missing this drop is not an option if you want to understand the full story. Do the two things now. Understand the internal rot and the external profit. Feed your knowledge with the truth of these events. I will see you tomorrow. Green was the color of their destiny, and Ghazghkull, now more a force of nature than a mere warboss, was its unstoppable agent. His defeat on Armageddon had served only to temper his ambition in the fires of tactical reality, teaching him a valuable lesson about the resilience and adaptability of the Imperium when properly led. The old man, Yarrick, had proven that humans were not just squishy runts to be crumped, but a foe that required a new level of orc cunning to overcome. This revelation did not deter him. It invigorated him, setting him on a new path across the galaxy to gather the scattered tribes and forge them into a warog, the likes of which had not been seen since the War of the Beast. Back on Armageddon, the years following the Second War were a period of intense reconstruction and militarization under the unyielding gaze of Commissar Yarrick, now the de facto planetary governor. The ruins of fallen hives were cleared, their populations relocated to newly reinforced megastructures. The industrial output, once geared towards general imperial tithes, was now focused almost exclusively on planetary defense. The Steel Legion, no longer just a standard Imperial Guard regiment, was transformed into one of the most experienced and well-equipped Ork hunting forces in the entire Segmentum Solar. Yarrick instituted a planet-wide militia training program, ensuring that every able-bodied citizen, from the lowest factorum worker to the highest spire-born noble, could handle a lasgun and knew how to fight a greenskin. He turned Armageddon into a fortress, its plains crisscrossed with trench lines, its cities ringed with macro cannon emplacements, and its skies patrolled by newly commissioned fighter wings. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his very soul, that Ghazghkull was not dead, and that the prophet would one day return to finish what he started. His paranoia was well-founded. Far out in the galactic east, Ghazghkull's damaged space hulk, the world killer, limped towards the orc-held world of Golgotha. It was here, amidst a brutal civil war between rival mechboys, that Ghazghkull would undergo his next great transformation. During a particularly ferocious battle, a collapsing gargant crushed his body, leaving him a mangled wreck of flesh and bone, once again on the brink of death. It was Mad Doc Grotznik who, with a cackle of insane genius, rebuilt his master. Using the prime scrap from the fallen gargant, he encased Ghazghkull's broken form in a massive suit of mega armor, grafting it directly to his bones and nervous system. His already formidable skull was further reinforced, and his remaining organic parts were augmented with bionics, turning him into a veritable demigod of war, a towering titan of metal and muscle. This new form, coupled with the immense psychic power of the Warag, energy he now commanded, made him more powerful than ever before. From Golgotha, he began his great crusade in earnest. His new form was a symbol of orc power, and his victories were swift and absolute. He traveled from one orc-dominated system to another, not merely conquering but assimilating. He brought with him the vision of the Great Green, the promise of an endless war that would drown the galaxy. He united the warring clans, crushing those who resisted and elevating those who showed promise. His Warag grew exponentially, absorbing the mechs of Ryza, the speed freaks of the Denorian sector, and the feral beast snaggers of the Octarius Empire. He was no longer just a warlord. He was a unifying force, a religious icon for the entire orc race. His fleet swelled from a handful of crude barges into a true armada, a ramshackle and terrifying collection of thousands of kill cruisers, rocks, and captured imperial vessels, all crewed by trillions of greenskins baying for blood. As the 41st millennium drew to its tumultuous close, 57 years after the end of the Second War, the omens began to appear. Astropathic choirs across the segmentum solar screamed of a vast, green psychic tide building in the warp. Imperial scout vessels operating near the Armageddon sector began to vanish without a trace. Yarrick, now ancient but no less formidable, felt it in his bones. He doubled the patrols, placed the entire planet on high alert, and sent out a final, desperate plea for aid to the High Lords of Terror. The storm was coming. The Third War for Armageddon was about to begin. It was on the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, a holy day across the Imperium, that Ghazghkull returned. His arrival was not a lumbering approach like before, but a sudden, shocking materialization. Using advanced and highly unstable teleporter technology perfected by his mechboys, his entire fleet simply appeared in high orbit over Armageddon, bypassing the outer system defenses entirely. The initial orbital bombardment was catastrophic. Entire continents were set ablaze as asteroids, repurposed ship hulks, and orbital debris rained down upon the planet. A brutal opening salvo designed to shatter Imperial morale and defenses. The scale of the attack was beyond anything the defenders had anticipated, 100 times larger than the invasion of the Second War. From the burning skies came the drop pods and the landing craft, a green deluge that swarmed across every continent simultaneously. This time there was no single spearhead, no focused assault on one region. Ghazghkull's strategy was one of total, overwhelming war. Orc hordes landed in the fiery wastes of Armageddon Prime, in the dense jungles of Armageddon Secundus, and even on the ice caps of the polar regions. The Imperial defenders, despite their years of preparation, were stretched to the breaking point, forced to fight a multi-front war against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. The fortress that Yarrick had so carefully constructed was now a global siege. The initial fighting was savage beyond description. In the north, the Steel Legion's 12th Armored Regiment made a valiant stand at the Mannheim Gap, holding back a tide of Goth battle wagons for 3 days before being utterly annihilated. In Hive Acheron, the same city liberated by the Blood Angels decades prior, the local militia fought house to house against waves of evil Sun's speed freaks, turning the streets into a charnel house. Ghazghkull himself made his presence known immediately. Leading the assault on the heavily fortified Hive Tartarus, he teleported directly into the command spire, his new mega-armored form shrugging off heavy bolter fire as if it were rain. He personally tore the Hive's defending general in half with his power claw, his roar of victory broadcast across the planetary Vox network, a chilling declaration that the true master of Armageddon had returned. Commissar Yarrick, directing the defense from the command center of Hive Hades, the site of his greatest triumph, was forced to make impossible decisions. He coordinated strategic withdrawals, sacrificed entire regiments to buy time, and funneled his precious reserves to the most critical sectors. He knew that he could not defeat this Warog with the forces he had. Armageddon's only hope lay in holding out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. This time, however, the Imperium was slow to respond. The galaxy was in turmoil, reeling from the formation of the Great Rift and the incursions of chaos across countless worlds. Armageddon, once a priority, was now just one of many desperate cries for help in an Imperium on the verge of collapse. Yet help did come, though not in the numbers they had prayed for. The Black Templars, zealous crusaders ever eager for battle, were the first to arrive, their battle barge, the Eternal Crusader, punching a hole through the Ork orbital blockade. Led by the High Marshal Helbrecht himself, the Templars deployed directly into the most intense fighting around Hive Hellsreach, their land raiders and crusader squads carving a bloody path through the Ork lines. They were soon followed by elements of the Salamanders and the White Scars, each chapter adding their unique brand of warfare to the desperate defense. They brought hope, but they also brought the grim realization that this would not be a swift victory like the last war. This would be a grinding, brutal war of attrition that could last for years, a conflict that would bleed both sides white and scar the planet forever. Ghazghkull, for his part, seemed to revel in the renewed conflict. His primary focus was not just the conquest of the planet, but the final, personal defeat of Commissar Yarrick. He directed a significant portion of his best troops, the elite Goth Nobs and Meganobs, in a relentless siege of Hades' Hive. He wanted to break the old man, to shatter the symbol of imperial defiance that Yarrick had become. The two great commanders once again entered into a deadly game of strategy and counter-strategy, their moves and counter-moves deciding the fate of millions. Yarrick would use precision artillery strikes to break up Ork formations, and Ghazghkull would respond by using Ork weirdboys to summon psychic storms that would disrupt imperial communications. It was a war fought on a scale so immense that entire hive sectors were reduced to rubble in a single day's fighting. One of the most pivotal engagements of the early war occurred at the battle for the Stygian docks. The Orks, under the command of a notorious mech boss known as Bagcrasher, attempted to capture the vital docklands to land their heavy gargants and other super-heavy war machines. The defense was led by the Salamander's Third Company, commanded by Captain Adrax Agatone. The volcanic, forged warriors of Nocturne proved to be masters of close-quarters fighting, using their flamers and thunder hammers to devastating effect in the claustrophobic confines of the industrial port. Captain Agatone himself engaged Bagcrasher in a titanic duel amidst the burning wreckage of a cargo hauler, his master-crafted hammer, Malleus Noctum, finally crushing the mech boss's skull after a prolonged and brutal fight. Though the Salamanders were victorious and the docks were held, the cost was immense, with nearly half of the company lost. It was a microcosm of the war itself. Every imperial victory was paid for in a river of blood. Meanwhile, High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, a man whose zeal was matched only by his hatred for Xenos, grew impatient with the defensive strategy. He advocated for a massive, decisive counterattack aimed directly at Ghazghkull's command center. Yarrick, ever the pragmatist, argued against it. knowing their forces were too thinly spread, and that such a move would leave other vital sectors vulnerable. This created a tension within the imperial command, a conflict between the Astartes' desire for a glorious, head-on charge and the Imperial Guard's grim understanding of a protracted war of attrition. This disagreement would have dire consequences as the war dragged on, with Helbrecht often launching independent crusades that, while glorious, sometimes undermined the overall defensive strategy. The war settled into a bloody stalemate. The Imperials held the major hive cities, turning them into impregnable fortresses, but the Orks controlled the vast wastelands and industrial zones between them. Life on Armageddon became a hellish existence. The sky was permanently choked with black smoke, the ground trembled with constant artillery fire, and the threat of an Ork raid was a constant, gnawing fear. Yet, the human spirit, under Yarrick's unwavering leadership, refused to break. The factories of the remaining hives continued to churn out weapons and munitions. The Steel Legion launched constant counter-raids into Ork territory, and the populace endured, fueled by a grim determination to never surrender their world. The Third War for Armageddon had become a symbol of the wider struggle of the Imperium in the age of the Dark Imperium, a desperate, unending fight for survival against a tide of darkness, with no end in sight. And at the heart of it all stood two figures, an ancient commissar and a greenskin prophet, locked in a duel that would decide the fate of a world and echo throughout the stars. The years that followed the Second War were a period of tense, uneasy reconstruction for Armageddon, a planet forever scarred by the conflict. Under the iron-willed administration of Commissar Yarrick, now the planet's de facto military governor, the shattered hives were slowly rebuilt, their spires once again reaching for the smog-choked skies. The industrial complexes of Tartarus and Infernus roared back to life, their foundries churning out tanks and munitions at a feverish pace, for Yarrick knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that Ghazghkull would return. The equatorial jungle remained a festering sore, a constant source of feral Ork raids that kept the newly reformed Steel Legion regiments blooded and vigilant, a grim training ground for the inevitable war to come. Yarrick transformed Armageddon into a fortress world of unprecedented scale, its defenses bolstered by orbital weapon platforms, vast minefields, and legions of battle-hardened guardsmen who knew their enemy not from picked reels or imperial primers, but from the brutal reality of close-quarters combat. Meanwhile, far from Armageddon, Ghazghkull was not idle. His escape from the Second War was not seen as a defeat by the Orks, but as a cunning retreat, a sign that Gork and Mork had bigger plans for their profit. His legend grew, fueled by tales of his duel with the one-eyed Yarrick and his miraculous survival. He began a new campaign of conquest, his Warog, swelling in size as it rampaged across dozens of imperial worlds, absorbing other Ork tribes and gathering immense resources. It was during this period, on the death world of Golgotha, that he tested his new theories of warfare. Here, he deliberately engaged a massive Imperial Guard force, including several Cadian regiments and Titans from Legio Invigilata, not for territory, but as a grand, bloody experiment. He perfected the use of coordinated clan attacks, refined his understanding of Imperial tactics, and most importantly, had Mad Doc Grotznik perform even more radical surgery upon his body, encasing his already formidable frame in a suit of mega armor so immense it was practically a walking tank, its power claw capable of tearing a lemon russ in half. Golgotha was a massacre for the Imperium, but for Ghazghkull it was a final, successful field test for the war machine he was building to crush Armageddon once and for all. 57 years after his initial invasion, the prophecies of Yarrick and the ambitions of Ghazghkull finally converged. In the year 998 M41, astropaths across the segmentum solar screamed as a psychic shockwave of pure, undiluted Warog energy erupted from the warp. This was not the slow, lumbering approach of the Second War. This was a tidal wave of green fury. Ghazghkull's new fleet, 1,000 times larger than his last, was a horrifying spectacle of mobile scrap heaps, stolen imperial cruisers, and colossal rocks bristling with city-leveling weaponry. He did not aim for a single landing zone. He aimed for the entire planet. His invasion began with a cataclysmic orbital bombardment, not just of rocks, but of entire orc tribes crammed into crude drop pods, turning Armageddon's skies into a rain of death and fire. But this time, Armageddon was ready. Yarrick, now an ancient man kept alive by augmetics and sheer spite, commanded the planetary defense from the command throne of the fortress of Hades' hive. The orbital defense lasers, painstakingly constructed over decades, vaporized hundreds of orc vessels, while vast formations of thunderbolts and marauder bombers engaged the orc landers in the upper atmosphere, turning the heavens into a chaotic dogfight. On the ground, the Steel Legion, now a massive and well-equipped army, met the orc drop zones not with panicked lines of conscripts, but with pre-sighted artillery fire, massed lemon rust tank companies, and an unshakable resolve forged in the fires of the last war. The third war for Armageddon had begun, and it was immediately clear that this would be a conflict of a scale far exceeding anything that had come before, a meat grinder that would consume billions. The initial landings were apocalyptic. Entire continents were set ablaze as orc rocks slammed into the planet's surface with the force of extinction-level events. The cities of Armageddon Prime, rebuilt with such effort, were once again plunged into brutal urban combat. Ghazghkull, however, had learned from his previous obsession with Hades' hive. This time, his strategy was one of total, overwhelming war on all fronts. He designated two of his most powerful subordinates to lead the main assaults, freeing himself to act as a mobile commander, appearing at critical battlefields to shatter imperial lines with his personal presence. The first of these was Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub, a bad moon warlord of incredible cunning and technological prowess, whose personal mech boys had developed shockingly advanced teleporter technology. The second was the gargantuan Goth warboss, Badfrag the Unstoppable, a mountain of muscle and rage who led the charge against the heavily fortified hive cities. Nazdreg's forces materialized seemingly at random behind imperial lines, his bad moons appearing in flashes of green energy to sabotage supply depots, assassinate imperial commanders, and capture key infrastructure. His most audacious move was the capture of the Mannheim Dam, a critical power source for the hives of Armageddon Secundus. The Steel Legion's 121st Regiment was annihilated in a surprise teleport assault, and Nazdreg began repurposing the dam's massive generators to power a gargantuan energy weapon, threatening to carve the entire continent in two. Meanwhile, Badfrag's Goth hordes slammed against the walls of Hive Acheron and Hive Tempestora in human waves, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the defenders through attrition alone. The fighting was relentless, a constant cacophony of bolter fire, artillery explosions, and the guttural roar of the Warog. Yarrick, from his command center, masterfully coordinated the defense, shifting regiments and armored companies like pieces on a regicide board. He anticipated orc movements, reinforced faltering sectors, and launched daring counterattacks, his tactical acumen the only thing preventing the planet's defenses from collapsing entirely. He was aided by a massive influx of imperial reinforcements. Having foreseen the war, Yarrick's original astropathic calls had not been for immediate aid, but for the pre-emptive mustering of a crusade-level force. Thus, the orcs were met not only by the Steel Legion, but by dozens of other famous Guard regiments, including the Mordian Iron Guard, the Talan Desert Raiders, and the indomitable Catachan Jungle Fighters, who found the feral orc-infested jungles a familiar and welcome battleground. Space Marine chapters also answered the call in force. The Black Templars, under the command of High Marshal Helbrecht, arrived with a full crusade fleet, their righteous fury a perfect match for the greenskin tide. They were joined by the salamanders, returning to defend a world they had bled for before. Their master crafted flamers perfect for clearing orc-infested hive sectors. The Blood Angels, though engaged elsewhere, sent several successor chapters, including the Flesh Tearers, whose unrestrained ferocity proved devastating in the claustrophobic confines of urban warfare. This coalition of forces, under the overall strategic command of Yarrick, formed a bulwark against Ghazghkull's apocalyptic invasion, turning the entire planet into a single, contiguous war zone where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. The war devolved into a series of legendary and brutal campaigns. In the Deadlands, the shattered remnants of Hive Volcanus, the Catachan jungle fighters waged a bitter guerrilla war against feral orc tribes, their traps and ambushes turning the toxic wasteland into a death zone for the greenskins. On the Stygian River, the Talon 24th Armored Regiment engaged in massive tank battles against orc cult of speed warbands, the plains littered with the burning wrecks of lemon rust tanks and orc battle wagons. The most critical front, however, was the siege of Hive Hellsreach. Badfrag the Unstoppable had concentrated the bulk of his forces here, his gargants pounding the city's walls to dust while his boys swarmed through the breaches. The defense of Hellsreach fell to the Black Templars, led by the stoic and fanatical Reclusiarch Grimaldus. For months, Grimaldus and his handful of space marines, alongside millions of Steel Legionnaires and Hive militia, held the city against impossible odds, their defense becoming a symbol of imperial defiance that inspired the entire planet. Grimaldus himself became a legend, standing atop the rubble of the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, reciting litanies of hate as he personally slew orc warbosses with his Crozius Arcanum. Yet for every imperial victory, there was a devastating loss. The orcs, driven by Ghazghkull's Warog. Energy were a seemingly endless tide. For every orc that fell, two more seemed to take its place, their crude weapons and unshakable belief in victory a potent combination. Ghazghkull himself remained an elusive but terrifying presence. He appeared at the Battle of the Fire Wastes, personally leading a charge of mega knobs that broke the back of the Mordian 8th Iron Guard, shattering their perfect firing lines with contemptuous ease. He was sighted again in the skies above Tartarus, directing an attack by orc fighter bombers that crippled a Legio Metallica Titan, his bellowing laughter audible over the Vox network. His rivalry with Yarrick had transcended a mere tactical duel. It had become a personal vendetta that defined the entire war. Each knew that the fate of Armageddon would ultimately be decided when the two of them finally met on the battlefield once more. That moment drew closer as Ghazghkull, having assessed the stalemate across the planet, decided on a decisive, war-winning move. He gathered a colossal new army, spearheaded by his elite Goth shock troops, and launched a direct assault on the most fortified and symbolic location on the entire planet, Hades' Hive, the seat of Commissar Yarrick's command. Ghazghkull knew that if he could take Hades, crush its defenders, and personally slay his old rival, the morale of the entire Imperial defense would shatter, and Armageddon would finally be his. He broadcast his challenge across all channels, a guttural roar in the orc tongue that needed no translation. Yarrick, I've come for YA. The final act of the war was about to begin as the greatest orc Warog in millennia descended upon the single most heavily defended city in the Imperium, a confrontation that would decide the fate of a world and echo across the stars for centuries to come. Yarrick, standing on the command deck of his adamantium-shielded bastion, watched the approaching green tide on the long-range picked screens. The sheer scale of the force was staggering, a sea of rusted metal and roaring engines that stretched to the horizon, surmounted by the silhouettes of dozens of gargants. He felt no fear, only a cold, grim satisfaction. This was the moment he had prepared for, the culmination of over 50 years of vigilance. He opened a planet-wide Vox channel, his voice, raspy with age but infused with unshakable authority, cutting through the static of battle. He is here, he announced to the millions of soldiers under his command. The beast has come to our door. We have known this day would come. We have prepared. We have sharpened our blades and loaded our guns. Every soul on this planet, every guardsman of the Legion, every son of the Emperor now looks to Hades' hive. Let them look. Let them see how men of the Imperium die. Let them see how we make the alien pay for every inch of our soil. For the Emperor. For Armageddon, the siege of Hades' hive began with an artillery barrage of unimaginable intensity. Ork lobbers and big guns, some the size of buildings, hurled thousands of tons of high explosives, scrap metal, and even captured guardsmen at the city's void shields. The sky turned black with ordnance, the shields shimmering and groaning under the relentless impacts, glowing cherry red before sections began to flicker and fail. Under the cover of this bombardment, the Ork ground forces advanced. Waves of Goth boys charged across the mine-strewn plains, their crude faith in Gork and Mork protecting many from the shrapnel and explosions that turned the earth into a churning hellscape. They were followed by legions of trucks and battle wagons, their deaf rollers grinding over the wreckage of their fallen comrades to smash into the outer trench lines. The Steel Legion met them with disciplined fury. From the battlements of the hive, lascannon and autocannon batteries scythed through the Ork vehicles, while heavy bolters tore apart the charging infantry. Basilisk and Manticore artillery batteries, positioned deep within the hive, returned fire, their creeping barrages obliterating entire mobs of Orks before they could reach the walls. The fighting in the outer trenches was savage and without quarter. Steel legionnaires, their bayonets fixed, held their ground against Orks twice their size. The narrow confines of the trenches filled with the screams of the dying and the roar of chainswords. Ogrin auxiliaries proved their worth, their immense strength and ripper guns holding critical junctions against overwhelming numbers, their loyalty to the commissar absolute. Yet the Orks kept coming. Ghazghkull's tactical genius was on full display. He used speed freak outriders to flank the main defensive lines, forcing Yarrick to commit his mobile reserves early. He had his mech's tunnel under the minefields, planting enormous bombs that blew gaping holes in the Imperial defenses, through which poured elite knobs in mega armor. Above, Ork Dakajets dueled with Imperial Navy thunderbolts, the wreckage of both falling like burning rain upon the battlefield below. The Gargants lumbered forward, their main weapons targeting the hive's primary weapon emplacements and void shield generators. A warlord titan of the Legio Metallica, the Steel Hammer, strode forth from the city gates to meet them, its plasma annihilator turning the lead Gargant into a molten slag heap before it was swarmed by three others, its legs torn from its torso by massive power claws in a brutal display of overwhelming force. For 7 days and 7 nights, the battle raged without pause. The outer defenses were overrun, then retaken in bloody counterattacks, only to be lost again. The casualty count rose into the millions. The very ground around Hades' hive became a slurry of mud, blood, and metal. Inside the hive, Yarrick orchestrated the defense with inhuman stamina, never sleeping, subsisting on nutrient paste and sheer hatred for the enemy. He directed every artillery strike, every troop movement, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. He knew that Ghazghkull was not simply throwing his forces away. He was probing, testing, searching for the one critical weakness he could exploit to deliver the killing blow. That blow came on the 8th day. Under the cover of a massive dust storm whipped up by the constant explosions, a coven of Ork weirdboys gathered. Channeling the immense psychic energy of the Warog, they unleashed a psychic storm of unprecedented power. It did not target the walls or the soldiers, but the hive's primary auspex and communication arrays. The complex sensoriums and vox casters overloaded in showers of sparks, plunging the Imperial command into chaos. For a critical 15-minute period, Yarrick was blind and deaf, cut off from his army. It was the opening Ghazghkull had been waiting for. From the heart of his army, he unleashed his trump card. a colossal orc war machine, larger than any gargant, a moving fortress cathedral of scrap metal and guns known as the Temple of Gork. Atop this monstrosity, surrounded by his Goth guard, stood Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka himself. The temple did not attack the walls. It moved towards a section of the hive that cantilevered out over the chasm known as the Gorge of Hades. Its purpose was not to breach the hive, but to serve as a mobile assault bridge to its upper levels. As the temple slammed into the hive superstructure, its boarding ramps crashing down onto the hab levels and manufactorums, Yarrick realized the true nature of the attack. Ghazghkull was not trying to conquer the hive from the ground up. He was launching a decapitation strike, aimed directly at the command spire where Yarrick himself was located. The Vox channels crackled back to life, filled with panicked reports of a massive orc breakthrough in Sector Gamma 9, the sector directly below the command bastion. Yarrick knew his time as a strategic commander was over. The battle had now come to him. He grabbed the ornate power claw that served as his right hand, its motors whining to life. Turning to his personal retinue of veteran Steel Legionnaires and Schola Progenium stormtroopers, he gave his final order. "He wants a duel," Yarrick rasped, his one good eye gleaming with cold fire. "Let's not keep him waiting." The fighting inside the hive was a brutal, multi-level nightmare. Ghazghkull and his mega knobs carved a path of destruction through the hab blocks and corridors, their heavy armor deflecting most small arms fire and their power claws tearing through barricades and bulkheads. The hive's defenders, a mix of Steel Legion, hive militia, and even armed factory workers, fought back with suicidal bravery. They turned every corridor into a kill zone, detonating promethium pipes to incinerate orc mobs and collapsing entire levels to slow the advance. The air was thick with smoke, cordite, and the coppery smell of blood. Yarrick led his own forces down from the command spire, meeting Ghazghkull's advance head-on in the cavernous expanse of the Grand Processional of St. Catherine. The two forces slammed into each other with the force of a tectonic collision. Yarrick was a whirlwind of motion, his power claw crushing orc skulls while his storm bolter, the Bale Eye, spat explosive shells into the green tide. He was the calm center of a storm of violence, his mere presence inspiring the humans around him to feats of impossible heroism. But the orcs were led by a demigod of war. Ghazghkull was an unstoppable force, his twin-linked shooter cutting down guardsmen in swathes, while his claw of Gork ripped apart ogrins and even sentinels that stood in his path. Finally, through the maelstrom of battle, the two commanders locked eyes. The combatants around them, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, seemed to pull back, creating a small arena amidst the carnage. Ghazghkull let out a bellowing laugh, the sound echoing through the vast chamber. "One eye," he roared, pointing his massive claw. "I came back for you." Yarrick raised his own power claw in response, his face a grim mask of determination. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The fate of Armageddon, the culmination of decades of hatred and war, would be settled here now, in a duel between an old man who refused to die and a monster who believed he was a god. With a final, earth-shaking roar, Ghazghkull charged, and Yarrick stood his ground, ready to meet the apocalypse head-on. The two living legends of the 41st millennium clashed, power claw against power claw, the impact sending out a shockwave that shattered the stained glass windows depicting the saints of the Imperium. The duel was a contest of impossible contrasts. Ghazghkull was a force of nature, his every blow capable of pulverizing ferrocrete, his mega armor shrugging off impacts that would destroy a small tank. Yarrick was a being of pure, unadulterated will, his ancient body pushed far beyond its limits by augmetics and a lifetime of war. He could not match Ghazghkull's strength, so he used his cunning. He dodged and weaved, using his smaller size to his advantage, forcing the massive orc to over-commit to his swings. He targeted the joints and cabling of Ghazghkull's armor with precise shots from his storm bolter, scoring glancing hits that sparked and hissed. For every thunderous blow he narrowly avoided, Yarrick answered with a swift counter, his power claw gouging furrows in the orc's adamantium-laced plating. The battle raged, a microcosm of the wider war. Around them, their elite guards fought their own desperate battles. The Steel Legion veterans formed a disciplined ring of Lars fire around their commissar, while Ghazghkull's Goth guard crashed against them like a battering ram. But the focus of all was the two commanders. Ghazghkull grew increasingly furious, his blows becoming wilder and more savage. He was a prophet, the voice of the gods, yet this frail, one-eyed Umi refused to break, refused to die. With a roar of frustration, he swept his claw low, catching Yarrick off balance and sending him tumbling across the floor. Before the commissar could recover, Ghazghkull brought his massive iron-shod boot down, pinning Yarrick to the ground, the ceramite of his breastplate cracking under the immense pressure. "Now you die, one eye," Ghazghkull gloated, raising his claw of Gork for the final, killing blow. Yarrick, trapped and grievously wounded, stared up at the descending claw, his face grim but defiant. This was the end he had always expected. But as the claw fell, a new sound cut through the din of battle, the piercing shriek of jump packs. A flash of black and white armor descended from the shattered dome of the processional. High Marshal Helbrecht and a retinue of Black Templar sword brethren slammed into the battlefield, their power swords and thunder hammers crashing into the Goth guard's flank. The sudden, violent intervention of the Astartes caught the orcs completely by surprise. Helbrecht himself, his eyes burning with righteous fury, charged directly towards Ghazghkull, his own power sword aimed at the warboss's head. Forced to divert his killing blow from Yarrick, Ghazghkull spun to meet the new threat, his claw catching Helbrecht's blade in a shower of brilliant sparks. The pressure on Yarrick was released. Gasping for air, the old commissar saw his chance. While Ghazghkull was locked in combat with the High Marshal, Yarrick crawled, his body screaming in protest, towards a fallen Ogrin, grabbing one of the massive crack grenades from its belt. With the last of his strength, he armed the grenade and jammed it deep into the already damaged knee joint of Ghazghkull's mega armor. The explosion was devastating. It blew Ghazghkull's leg clean off at the knee, sending the colossal warboss crashing to the ground with a bellow of agony and rage. The psychic shock of the prophet's fall was felt by every orc in the hive. Their confidence faltered, the warag, energy that fueled their frenzy flickering for a critical instant. Seeing their leader crippled and their elite guard beset by furious space marines, panic began to spread through the orc ranks. The tide of the battle had turned in a single moment. Helbrecht pressed his advantage, his sword brethren carving a bloody path through the now disorganized Goth guard. But Ghazghkull was not yet beaten. Roaring in defiance, he propped himself up on one arm and unleashed a torrent of fire from his shoulder-mounted guns, forcing the Templars back. His gaze fell upon the prone form of Yarrick, and even through his pain, his eyes burned with a newfound respect. He knew he was beaten for now. His decapitation strike had failed, and his body was broken. Grabbing a Vox link, he roared a single command into the orc network. "Get me out!" Moments later, the air crackled with green energy. Mad Doc Grotznik and a team of mechs, using one of Nazdreg's experimental teleporters, materialized beside their fallen master. In a flash of light and a squeal of tortured machinery, they were gone, leaving behind a scene of carnage and a stunned imperial victory. The sight of their prophet vanishing and the ferocity of the Black Templars' charge broke the back of the orc assault on Hades' hive. The attack faltered, then turned into a chaotic retreat as the greenskins streamed back towards their landing zones. The great siege was over. In the aftermath, Yarrick was recovered, barely clinging to life. His body was shattered, but his spirit was unbroken. He had faced his nemesis, and with the aid of the Black Templars had emerged victorious. The defeat of Ghazghkull's personal assault on Hades' hive was the turning point of the Third War for Armageddon. Though the war was far from over, with billions of orcs still infesting the planet and Nazdreg still controlling key territories, The primary strategic objective of the Warhog had been thwarted. The prophet had been humbled, his aura of invincibility shattered. The imperium had held. The conflict ground on for several more years, a brutal war of attrition across the entire planet. The focus shifted to dismantling the remaining orc strongholds. The Black Templars, their righteous crusade now fully committed, led the charge to retake Hive Hellsreach from the remnants of Badfrag's army, a campaign that would go down in their chapter's history as one of their most glorious and costly. The Salamanders, masters of siegecraft, led the assault on Nasdreg's fortified position at the Mannheim Dam, their Prometheum-based weaponry turning the orcs' technological marvels into molten ruin. The Steel Legion, under the recovering but ever-present command of Yarrick, methodically cleansed sector after sector, their grim determination never wavering. Ghazghkull, meanwhile, had been taken by Grotznik to a hidden mech base where his body was rebuilt. His shattered leg was replaced with a massive bionic construct, and his mega armor was repaired and enhanced. But the physical wounds were less significant than the psychological ones. His defeat at the hands of Yarrick and Helbrecht had taught him a valuable lesson. Brute force and even cunning strategy were not enough. He had been outmaneuvered and for the first time truly beaten. This realization did not diminish his ambition, it refined it. He understood that his Warhog needed to evolve. He began to see the galaxy not just as a place to conquer, but as a grand strategic game board. His vision expanded beyond Armageddon. He saw a galaxy teetering on the brink, with the great rift tearing reality asunder, and he saw his own role in it not just as a conqueror, but as the unifying force of the Great Green, a storm that would sweep away the dying empire of man and the insidious forces of chaos alike. His final act in the Armageddon system was one of sheer spite and terrifying foresight. He abandoned the ground war, leaving his remaining warbosses to fight and die, a final bloody distraction. He gathered his fleet, and instead of retreating, launched a surprise attack on the Imperial naval base at Port Roth. The Imperial Navy, believing the Orc fleet to be a spent force, was caught completely off guard. Ghazghkull's ships smashed through the orbital defenses and destroyed dozens of capital ships, crippling the Imperium's ability to reinforce the sector for years to come. Then, with the Imperial fleet in ruins, he gathered the remnants of his Warhog and simply vanished into the warp, his destination unknown. He left Armageddon a bleeding, scarred, but ultimately defiant world. He had lost the battle, but in his mind, the Great War was only just beginning. The Third War for Armageddon never truly ended. It simply transitioned into a new, perpetual state of conflict. The planet remained a war zone, with constant fighting against the feral orc tribes that now infested every continent, a constant, gnawing fear. Yet, the human spirit, under Yarrick's unwavering leadership, refused to break. The factories of the remaining hives continued to churn out weapons and munitions. The Steel Legion launched constant counter-raids into Orc territory, and the populace endured, fueled by a grim determination to never surrender their world. The Third War for Armageddon had become a symbol of the wider struggle of the Imperium in the age of the Dark Imperium. A desperate, unending fight for survival against a tide of darkness, with no end in sight. And at the heart of it all stood two figures, an ancient commissar and a greenskin prophet, locked in a duel that would decide the fate of a world and echo throughout the stars. Both had survived their final confrontation, each having learned from the other. Yarrick knew that Ghazghkull's escape meant the threat was not over, but merely postponed, and he dedicated the rest of his long life to hunting the beast across the galaxy, a personal crusade that would take him far from the world he had saved. Ghazghkull, for his part, now saw Yarrick not just as a rival, but as the perfect opponent, the ultimate test of his power. He believed that the final, true apocalypse, the coming of the Great Green, could only be heralded by a final, galaxy-shattering confrontation with the old one-eyed commissar. The fate of one man had become inextricably linked with the destiny of the entire Orc race. a personal vendetta that now threatened to engulf entire sectors in a new and even more terrible war. The echoes of their conflict on Armageddon would serve as the prelude to this greater, more horrifying symphony of destruction. It was a war that had now transcended a single planet, becoming a legend that would be told with fear and awe for millennia. The fires on Armageddon still burned, a testament to the cost of victory and a grim portent of the battles yet to come. With constant artillery fire and the threat of an orc raid was a constant, gnawing fear. Yet, the human spirit, under Yarrick's unwavering leadership, refused to break. The factories of the remaining hives continued to churn out weapons and munitions. The Steel Legion launched constant counter-raids into orc territory, and the populace endured, fueled by a grim determination to never surrender their world. The Third War for Armageddon had become a symbol of the wider struggle of the Imperium in the age of the Dark Imperium. A desperate, unending fight for survival against a tide of darkness, with no end in sight. And at the heart of it all stood two figures, an ancient commissar and a greenskin prophet, locked in a duel that would decide the fate of a world and echo throughout the stars. This personal war would eventually draw both away from the world that had defined them, as Yarrick, granted unprecedented authority by the High Lords of Terror, took command of a vast fleet with the singular mission of hunting Ghazghkull down, no matter the cost. He pursued his quarry relentlessly, their conflict becoming a running battle across multiple star systems. On the world of Persina IV, Yarrick cornered a portion of Ghazghkull's forces, only for the warboss to lure him into a trap, sacrificing millions of his own boys just to inflict a telling blow on Yarrick's fleet. The chase became an obsession for both, each trying to outwit the other, their armies mere pawns in a galactic game of strategy and hatred. Yarrick's intelligence network became single-mindedly focused on predicting Ghazghkull's next move, while Ghazghkull seemed to revel in the pursuit, leaving taunting glyphs and goading messages for his old adversary. It was on the desolate moon of Baal Alpha that they would clash again, not with armies, but in a small, brutal skirmish. Yarrick, acting on intelligence, led a personal strike team of Kassakin to ambush Ghazghkull during a meeting with his subordinate warbosses. The trap was sprung, but Ghazghkull, ever cunning, had anticipated it. The ensuing firefight was chaotic, and once again the two leaders found themselves locked in close combat. This time there were no armies to watch, no greater strategic concerns, just the raw, personal fury of their rivalry. Yarrick, now older and slower, fought with the grim experience of 1,000 battles, while Ghazghkull, his body more machine than flesh, was faster and stronger than ever before. The duel was short and inconclusive, broken apart by their respective bodyguards, with both combatants forced to withdraw, each bearing new scars and a renewed, burning hatred for the other. This encounter solidified in both their minds that their war could only end with the death of one of them, and that Armageddon was merely the first chapter in their bloody saga. The wider Imperium watched this personal war with a mixture of awe and terror, realizing that the actions of these two individuals could ignite conflicts that would dwarf even the terrible wars for Armageddon. The hunt continued, a shadow play across the stars, pulling more worlds and more armies into its devastating orbit, a testament to the power of a single, enduring rivalry to shape the fate of the galaxy itself. Ghazghkull's power grew exponentially with each world he conquered and each fleet he crushed in his flight from Yarrick. He was no longer just a warboss. He had become a symbol, the living embodiment of the Warag. Orcs from across the galaxy flocked to his banner, drawn by the psychic call of his immense power and the promise of the ultimate fight. He was building not just an army, but a new orc society, a nomadic, space-faring empire of war, with himself as its undisputed prophet king. He called this new crusade the Great Warag, a conflict intended to sweep across the entirety of Segmentum Obscurus and challenge the forces of both the Imperium and Chaos. His strategic acumen had evolved to a terrifying degree. He began to manipulate galactic events, using chaos incursions as distractions and timing his attacks to coincide with Tyranid hive fleet movements, showcasing a level of foresight that left Imperial strategists baffled and terrified. They were no longer fighting a mere brute. They were fighting a military genius with the resources of an entire species at his command. His ultimate goal, however, remained tied to Yarrick. He understood that to truly unify the orks and launch his final apocalyptic war, he needed a unifying event, a final victory so legendary it would ignite the soul of every greenskin. He needed to kill his great nemesis, not in some backwater skirmish, but on the grandest stage imaginable. And so he began to subtly herd the Imperial forces, laying a trail of broken worlds and cryptic clues designed to lead Yarrick and his entire fleet to one final, predetermined battlefield. A world he had chosen to be the stage for their final act, a heavily fortified cardinal world near the Cadian Gate, a planet named Sanctus Prime. It was a world that represented everything the Imperium held dear: faith, order, and defiance. To Ghazghkull, it was the perfect place to slaughter their greatest hero and break their spirit forever. Yarrick, for his part, knew he was being led. His instincts, honed by a century of fighting orcs, screamed that it was a trap, but he also knew he had no choice. To ignore the challenge would be to let Ghazghkull's power grow unchecked. And on a deeper, more personal level, he could not refuse. His life's purpose had become intertwined with this monster. He gathered his forces, calling on every favor and every ally he had made over his long career, from the grizzled veterans of the Steel Legion to the noble knights of several knightly houses, and even elements of the Adepta Sororitas from the Order of the Bloody Rose. He knew he was leading his men into an ambush of colossal proportions, but he went anyway, his one good eye fixed on the horizon, ready to face his destiny and end the threat of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, once and for all, or die in the attempt. The fate of the entire sector, and perhaps more, would be decided by this final, desperate gambit, a clash of titans on a world of saints. The journey to Sanctus Prime was fraught with peril, as Ghazghkull's fleets harried the Imperial Armada at every turn, launching hit and run attacks from asteroid fields and nebulas. These were not decisive engagements, but bleeding cuts, designed to whittle down Yarrick's strength and test his resolve. Yarrick's fleet masters performed admirably, their disciplined void warfare countering the chaotic orc assaults, but losses were mounting. Every ship lost was a blow, every casualty a testament to the scale of the trap they were knowingly entering. As they finally translated from the warp into the Sanctus system, the full horror of Ghazghkull's preparations was revealed. The space around Sanctus Prime was not empty. It was a graveyard of derelict ships and a fortress of armed-to-the-teeth orc rocks, forming a near-impenetrable blockade. Worse, the planet itself had been transformed. Its pristine continents were now scarred with massive orc glyphs visible from orbit, and its holy cities were ringed with crude but brutally effective defensive emplacements. Ghazghkull hadn't just occupied the world, he had desecrated it, turning it into a fortress of his own twisted design. The initial naval battle was one of the largest seen since the Gothic War. Imperial battleships traded broadsides with orc kill cruisers, while swarms of fighters and bombers filled the void between them. The Knights of House Tyrannis, launched from their transport barges, engaged orc mega-gargants that had been welded to the hulls of asteroids, their thermal cannons glowing white-hot as they carved through the Xenos monstrosities. The battle raged for days, a prelude to the even bloodier conflict that was to come on the world below. Yarrick knew a prolonged void war was unwinnable. He needed to get his forces to the surface and take the fight to Ghazghkull directly. In a daring maneuver, he concentrated his entire fleet on a single point in the orc blockade, using the venerable battleship Terminus Est as the tip of the spear. The ancient vessel, a relic from the Great Crusade, plunged into the heart of the orc fleet, its augmented armor shrugging off all but the most devastating hits, its colossal weapon batteries clearing a path. Through the breach poured the Imperial transports, streaking towards the planet's atmosphere under a hail of enemy fire. They were heading for the planetary capital, the Basilica of St. Catherine, where Auspex scans showed the largest concentration of Ork forces and a massive energy signature that could only be Ghazghkull himself. Yarrick was on the bridge of his own command lander, the hand of steel, watching the planet grow in the viewscreen. He felt a strange sense of calm. The chase was over. The game was at its end. He donned his peaked cap, straightened the lapels of his commissar's greatcoat, and gripped the controls of his power claw. The final battle was about to begin. As the landers screamed through the atmosphere, they were met by a storm of flak from the ground, the sky turning into a deadly maze of explosions and tracer fire. Many transports were hit, tumbling from the sky as burning coffins for the thousands of guardsmen inside. But enough got through. The Steel Legion, the Ghazghkull, the Sisters of Battle, and the Knights of House Tyrannes slammed into the designated landing zones on the outskirts of the capital city. They immediately came under ferocious attack. Ghazghkull had turned the entire city into a layered death trap. The streets were barricaded, the buildings were filled with snipers and heavy weapons teams, and beneath the ground, Ork mechs had dug a network of tunnels to launch surprise attacks. The battle for Sanctus Prime was not a battle of grand maneuvers. It was a brutal, street-by-street, room-by-room meat grinder. The Sisters of the Bloody Rose led the charge into the city proper, their faith a shield and their bolters a holy sword. They purged Ork infestations from hab blocks and sanctums with righteous flame, their hymns of battle a counterpoint to the savage war cries of the greenskins. The Knights of House Tyrannes provided heavy support, their massive forms striding through the ruined streets, their battle cannons obliterating Ork strongpoints, and their Reaper chainswords tearing apart Ork war machines. But the Orks were everywhere, their numbers seemingly infinite. And at the heart of the city, in the desecrated Grand Basilica, Ghazghkull waited. He had turned the holy sanctuary into his personal throne room, the golden statues of imperial saints replaced with crude effigies of Gork and Mork. He sat upon a throne of skulls and broken weaponry, watching the progress of the battle on crude, picked screens, a predator waiting for its prey to exhaust itself before delivering the final blow. He was not just waiting for Yarrick the commander, he was waiting for Yarrick the man. He had deployed his most elite forces, the Goth Guard, around the Basilica with explicit orders. They were not to kill the old commissar. They were to capture him and bring him to the throne room alive. Ghazghkull wanted Yarrick to see his Imperium's faith broken, to witness its holiest sites defiled, before he personally ripped the life from his body. The battle for the outer city raged for a week. Yarrick commanded from the front, his command squad a mobile headquarters that moved from crisis point to crisis point. He directed tank charges, coordinated artillery strikes, and his very presence was enough to shore up a collapsing defensive line. But he was pushing deeper and deeper into the city, closer and closer to the Basilica, and he knew it. He knew that every street he took was a step further into Ghazghkull's trap. On the 9th day, as his forces prepared for the final assault on the Basilica district, the Orks launched their masterstroke. From the hidden tunnels beneath the city, thousands of Ork commandos emerged, cutting off Yarrick's command squad from the main body of the Imperial army. Simultaneously, the Goth Guard launched a massive frontal assault, not on the Imperial lines, but directly at Yarrick's position. It was a perfectly executed pincer movement, designed not to win the battle, but to isolate and capture one man. Yarrick found himself surrounded, his small retinue of veterans fighting back to back against a tide of the largest and most ferocious Orks he had ever seen. Las fire and bolter shells ricocheted from the thick armor of the Goth Guard, who advanced relentlessly, their choppers and power claws taking a bloody toll on the commissar's bodyguard. One by one, his faithful veterans fell, until only Yarrick himself was left, standing over the bodies of his men, his power claw dripping with Ork blood. his storm bolter empty. A massive Goth knob, his face a mass of scars and crude bionics, lumbered forward, a huge stun maul crackling with energy in his hand. Yarrick met his charge, his claw tearing the orc's arm from its socket, but the knob's momentum carried it forward, and the stun maul slammed into the side of Yarrick's head. The world exploded in a flash of white light, and Sebastian Yarrick, the hero of Armageddon, knew no more. He awoke to the sound of guttural laughter and the stench of sweat, oil, and blood. He was chained, his arms stretched wide, against the desecrated high altar of the Grand Basilica. His weapons were gone, his greatcoat torn. Before him, seated on his throne of bone, was Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. The warboss stood, his immense frame blocking out the light from the shattered stained glass windows behind him. "So, One Eye," he rumbled, his voice a gravelly avalanche. "We meet again. Look around. Look at what I've done to your little god's house. Your people are dying. Your fleet is burning. Your world is mine. It's over." Yarrick spat a glob of blood onto the marble floor. "The Imperium will never fall to filth like you," he growled, his voice weak but filled with venom. "Kill me and be done with it." Ghazghkull laughed again, a deep, booming sound that shook the rafters. "Kill you? Oh no, that's not good enough. I'm gonna break you. I'm gonna make you watch as I burn everything you love. And then, when there's nothing left but ashes and your despair, then I'll kill you." He gestured to one of his mechs, who brought forward a crude, crackling device. "But first," Ghazghkull said, a cruel grin spreading across his tusked face, "a little gift. A front row seat to the end." The mech attached electrodes to Yarrick's temples. A picked screen flickered to life before him, showing a live feed of the battle outside. He could see his soldiers, leaderless and surrounded, being slaughtered. He could see the knights of House Tyrannis being pulled down by swarms of gargants. He could see the Sisters of Battle making their last stand in a burning cathedral. It was a vision of hell, and Ghazghkull was forcing him to watch every agonizing moment. "See, One Eye," the warboss whispered, his foul breath hot on Yarrick's face. "This is the great Warog. This is the future. There is no hope. Only green." But as Yarrick watched the screen, his despair was pierced by a flicker of movement. It was small at first, almost unnoticeable amidst the chaos. A single black and white dropship, a Ceastus assault ram, streaking through the flak-filled sky, ignoring the wider battle and heading directly for the Basilica. It was flying suicidally low and fast, a silver spear aimed at the heart of the orc command. Ghazghkull followed his gaze and grunted in annoyance. More flies to swat. He turned to bellow an order to his air defenses, but it was too late. The assault ram, its hull glowing from atmospheric friction and weapons fire, did not attempt to land. It simply smashed directly through the roof of the Basilica, its armored prow obliterating a huge section of the dome and sending a shower of stone and twisted metal down onto the throne room. It came to a grinding halt halfway through the chamber, its assault ramp slamming down before the dust had even settled. From within, silhouetted against the fires of the burning city, emerged High Marshal Helbrecht, his blade of judgment ignited, flanked by the grim, skull-helmed warriors of the Emperor's champion and his personal retinue of sword brethren. Helbrecht's gaze fell upon the chained form of Yarrick, then shifted to the colossal form of Ghazghkull. His voice, amplified by his helmet's vox grill, was cold with absolute, uncompromising hatred. "The witch, the beast, the heretic," he intoned, leveling his sword at the orc warboss. "For your blasphemy you shall be judged. For your heresy you shall be purged. I am the wrath of the Emperor, and I am your death." Ghazghkull roared in fury and delight. "The metal boy," he bellowed. "You came too. Good. Now I can kill all my favorite toys at once." He snatched his massive chopper, the kill cutter, from its rack beside the throne. The final, desperate battle for Sanctus Prime was about to reach its bloody climax within the ruins of the desecrated Basilica. The two forces charged each other, the black-clad fury of the Templars meeting the green tide of the Goth Guard in the center of the ruined chamber. Helbrecht and Ghazghkull ignored the lesser combatants. Their eyes locked on each other. They met in a clash that sent sparks flying, power soared against crude but brutally effective chopper. It was a duel of pure, focused aggression. Helbrecht was the superior swordsman, his movements a blur of precise, deadly strikes learned over centuries of constant warfare. But Ghazghkull was a whirlwind of brute force, his every swing powerful enough to shatter stone, his bionic body giving him an unnatural speed and resilience. While they fought, the sword brethren and the Goth guard tore each other apart. The Emperor's champion, a silent avatar of death, moved through the orc ranks, his black sword rising and falling, each swing ending the life of a greenskin knob. But the Goths were the elite of Ghazghkull's army, and they fought with a savage fanaticism, their numbers and brute strength beginning to overwhelm the small contingent of space marines. Yarrick, still chained to the altar, could only watch, helpless. He saw a sword brethren get pulled down by three knobs, his armor ripped apart. He saw the Emperor's champion take a grievous wound, a power claw punching through his chest plate. Helbrecht was being pushed back, his perfect technique struggling against Ghazghkull's relentless, overwhelming power. The High Marshal was going to die, the Imperium was going to lose, and it would be his fault for leading them into this trap. As Ghazghkull knocked Helbrecht's sword from his hand and raised his chopper for the killing blow, something inside Yarrick snapped. It was not reason or strategy or even hope. It was pure primal rage. With a scream that was not entirely human, he strained against his chains, his muscles tearing, his old bones groaning in protest. The ancient iron links, weakened by the crash of the assault ram and strained by his superhuman effort, shattered. Yarrick was free. He staggered forward, his body a canvas of pain, and saw a discarded orc chopper lying on the ground. He snatched it up. It was heavy, crude, unbalanced. But it would serve. Ghazghkull, his attention entirely on the disarmed Helbrecht, never saw him coming. Yarrick charged, his legs pumping, all his pain and hatred and fury focused into this one final, suicidal attack. He drove the jagged edge of the orc chopper deep into the back of Ghazghkull's already damaged bionic knee, the same spot he had targeted all those years ago on Armageddon. The warboss roared, a sound of pure agony and disbelief as his leg buckled under him. The distraction was all Helbrecht needed. The High Marshal, with a speed that belied his heavy armor, lunged forward, retrieving his fallen sword. As Ghazghkull turned to swat at the infuriating commissar on his back, Helbrecht drove his power sword up, under the warboss's chin, and deep into his brain. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the crackle of the power field. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of the Warog, stood frozen, a look of utter surprise on his face. Then the green light in his eyes flickered and died. The colossal orc collapsed, his fall shaking the very foundations of the basilica. A psychic death cry echoed through the warp, a wave of pure despair that washed over every orc on the planet. Their prophet was dead. Their gods had failed them. The Warog was broken. The remaining Goth guard, their morale shattered, faltered. The sword brethren, seeing their marshal victorious, rallied and cut them down. Yarrick collapsed beside the body of his nemesis, his energy spent, his life's purpose fulfilled. Helbrecht stood over the two of them, the fallen beast and the dying man, his sword dripping with alien blood. He looked at Yarrick, his helmet's lenses betraying no emotion. "You have fought well, commissar," he said, the highest praise a Black Templar could give. "The Emperor will know your name." Yarrick tried to respond, but only a bloody cough escaped his lips. His one good eye began to glaze over. He had done it. He had won. His long war was finally over. The death of Ghazghkull sent a shockwave through the orc forces across the planet. Leaderless and psychically bereft, their savage fury was replaced by confusion and fear. The Imperial forces, sensing the shift, launched a massive counterattack. The leaderless orc hordes, which had been on the verge of victory, shattered and fled. The battle for Sanctus Prime turned into a planet-wide rout. In the weeks that followed, the Imperium purged the remnants of Ghazghkull's great Warog from the system. It was a costly victory. Billions had died. A cardinal world had been all but destroyed. And Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, the savior of Armageddon and the slayer of the beast, succumbed to his wounds, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of service. He was laid to rest in the reclaimed basilica, a hero of the imperium, his name forever enshrined in legend. But the galaxy is a dark and unforgiving place. Legends fade, and even the most decisive victories can be fleeting. Deep in the warp, the nascent soul of Ghazghkull, a being of immense psychic power and unquenchable ambition, was not extinguished. It was gathered up by the collective, subconscious will of the orc race, the raw power of Gork and Mork themselves. They were not yet done with their prophet. And so, years later, on a forgotten mech world far from the light of the Astronomicon, a team of pain boys and mechs, following a set of impossibly complex instructions that had been burned into their minds, finished their greatest creation. They took the salvaged head of Ghazghkull, which Mad Doc Grotznik had mysteriously teleported away in the final moments of the battle, and placed it upon a new body. A body larger, stronger, and more powerful than ever before. A body of pure adamantium and rage, bristling with weapons that could level cities. With a final massive surge of warog energy, they threw a switch. The green light flared in the giant's eyes. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka was reborn. And his first thought was not of conquest, or of empire, or even of the imperium. It was of a single, stubborn, one-eyed man. He learned of Yarrick's death, and he was not pleased. He was furious. The Umi had cheated him. He had stolen his victory. He had denied him his destiny. A new warog began to gather, larger and more terrible than any before. But this was not a war of conquest. It was a war of pure, apocalyptic spite. Ghazghkull no longer wanted to rule the galaxy. He just wanted to burn it. And he would start with the world that had become his rival's tombstone. He would start with Armageddon. The cycle of war was not over. It was just beginning anew, driven by the rage of a resurrected monster, a monster who had lost the only thing in the universe that had ever truly mattered to him, his greatest enemy. The galaxy would tremble before his rage, a rage born not from a desire for victory, but from the simple, brutal fact that he was bored. And a bored Ghazghkull was the most dangerous thing in the universe. The new warog, which would become known to the terrified scribes of the imperium as the warog of the beast incarnate, did not strike at Armageddon first. That would have been too simple, too direct. The reborn Ghazghkull was thinking on a scale that even he had not previously conceived. He understood now that the imperium was a vast, rotting edifice, and to bring it down, one had to strike not at its limbs, but at its heart. He gathered his forces in the darkness of the Ghoul stars, a region of space shunned by all sane navigators. Here he forged his new empire, crushing other orc empires and absorbing them into his own, his power growing beyond all measure. He did not just build ships. He had his mechs build planetoids, entire moons hollowed out and fitted with colossal engines and weapons batteries. Attack moons of a size not seen since the War of the Beast. His first major strike was not a frontal assault, but an act of galactic sabotage. He dispatched his most cunning mechboys and commandos to key forge worlds and agri-worlds across the Segmentum Pacificus. They did not conquer these worlds. They crippled them, planting scrap code viruses in their noospheres, sabotaging their plasma reactors, and poisoning their food supplies. It was a campaign of chaos, designed to disrupt the Imperium's logistical spine, to weaken the giant before the killing blow. Imperial authorities were slow to react, attributing the widespread disruptions to cultist activity or local rebellions. They failed to see the larger pattern, the guiding intelligence behind the chaos. They were still fighting the last war, looking for massive fleets and frontal assaults, while Ghazghkull was fighting a new kind of war, a total war that targeted the very foundations of their civilization. Only a few, like the newly promoted Chapter Master Helbrecht of the Black Templars, felt a sense of dread. He had seen the look in Ghazghkull's eyes before he died. It was not the look of a beast, but of a cunning and malevolent intelligence. Helbrecht began his own crusade, a fleet-based hunt for the ghost of the orc warboss, a quest that many in the high command saw as a fool's errand. But Helbrecht remembered the words of Yarrick, his warnings about underestimating the greenskin menace. And so he hunted, a lone voice of reason in a galaxy determined to ignore the gathering storm. The storm finally broke over the world of Octarius. This sector was already a war zone, a massive conflict zone where a Tyrannid hive fleet had been locked in a seemingly endless war with a powerful orc empire. It was a conflict the Imperium was happy to let burn, as two of its greatest enemies bled each other dry. But Ghazghkull saw it not as a problem, but as an opportunity. He arrived in the Octarius sector not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. His fleet smashed into the Tyrannid armada, and he personally led the charge against the Norn queens and hive tyrants on the surface of the sector's main world. He did not just fight the Tyrannids, he studied them. He learned their tactics, their biology, their strengths and weaknesses. And then he did something no one thought possible. He won. He broke the back of the hive fleet, and in doing so, absorbed the entirety of the vast Octarian orc empire into his own warag. He now commanded the largest single orc force in millennia, an army hardened and made stronger by its war with the ultimate biological predator. And he had learned the secrets of the Tyrannids, secrets he intended to turn against the rest of the galaxy. From the conquered worlds of Octarius, he sent out a new psychic call, a message that echoed in the mind of every orc in the galaxy. It was a simple message. The biggest fight is common. Follow me and we'll show the universe what a real warag looks like. The Great Warag was no longer just an army. It was a movement, a species-wide migration towards a final, glorious war. And at its head was a being who had died and been reborn, a being who had fought the Imperium's greatest hero, the galaxy's greatest predators, and had emerged stronger. The Imperium, weakened by internal strife and the ever-growing threat of chaos, was about to face an enemy unlike any it had ever known, an enemy led by a monster who was not just fighting for territory or loot, but for the sheer, joyous ecstasy of galactic-scale annihilation. And his sights were now finally, irrevocably, set on the jewel of the Segmentum Solar, the symbol of his old enemy's defiance, the world that had haunted his dreams for over a century. The final, true third war for Armageddon was about to begin, and this time there would be no Yarrick to save them. The Imperium would face the storm alone, and the galaxy would hold its breath to see if it could survive. The initial reports from Armageddon were dismissed as mass hysteria. Sensor readings showed an entire moon detaching from its orbit around one of the system's gas giants and accelerating on a direct course for the planet. Such a thing was impossible, a violation of celestial mechanics. But then came the Vox hails, crude, bellowing orc transmissions that gloated and threatened, and the impossible became a terrifying reality. This was no mere attack moon. It was a celestial body, hollowed out and filled with a population of billions of orcs, its surface bristling with weapons that could crack continents. It was Ghazghkull's new flagship, a testament to the sheer, insane scale of his ambition. And it was just the vanguard. Behind it, tearing a hole in reality, came the rest of his fleet, a swarm of ships so vast it blotted out the stars. This was not an invasion. It was an extinction event. The planetary governor, a man named Tigranus, a descendant of the line that had replaced the disgraced Von Strabs, sent a desperate, frantic plea for aid to Terra. But help was light years away. Armageddon had been reinforced since the last war, its orbital defenses strengthened, its Steel Legion regiments at full strength. But they had prepared for a fleet, not for a weaponized planet. The orbital platforms were obliterated in the first salvo from the attack moon, their void shields overwhelmed in seconds. The Imperial Navy fleet in orbit, under the command of Admiral Parole, fought with incredible bravery, but they were like flies buzzing around a giant. Their torpedoes and lance strikes barely scratched the surface of the moon, while its return fire vaporized cruisers and battleships in single volleys. Admiral Parole, in his final act, ordered his entire remaining fleet to charge the moon, to ram it in a suicidal, last-ditch effort to alter its course. The sacrifice was glorious, a final, defiant blaze of imperial courage, but it was useless. The attack moon barely shuddered as it absorbed the impacts, its trajectory unaltered. On the surface of Armageddon, there was a strange, terrifying calm. The populace watched as a new moon grew in their sky, a jagged, ugly sphere of rock and metal that grew larger with every passing hour. There was no panic, no rioting. There was only a grim, stoic acceptance of their fate. They had lived their entire lives under the shadow of war, and they would die in it. The Steel Legion manned the walls of the hives, their lasguns pointed at the sky, ready to sell their lives dearly. In the cathedrals, the priests led the people in a final prayer to the emperor. The end had come. But then, a miracle. From the roiling chaos of the warp, a second fleet emerged. It was not an imperial fleet. It was a fleet of black and gold, its ships adorned with ancient, arcane symbols. It was the fleet of the Necrons, led by the Silent King, Yarrick, himself. The Silent King, in his silent, cold calculus, had determined that the threat of a united orc race under Ghazghkull was a greater long-term threat to his own plans for galactic dominion than the Imperium. And so, in a move that shocked the galaxy, he had come to intervene. The Necron fleet, with its advanced technology and weapons that defied the laws of physics, engaged the Orc armada. Beams of black light shot from the Necron tomb ships, causing Orc vessels to simply cease to exist. Waves of canoptek scarabs swarmed over the attack moon, their entropic mandibles eating away at its hull. The battle in the void above Armageddon became a three-way conflict of unimaginable scale and violence. Down on the planet, the defenders could only watch in stunned silence as their sky filled with the silent, ghostly green lights of the Necron fleet and the chaotic, fiery explosions of the Orc ships. They were no longer the main players in their own salvation. They were merely spectators to a war of gods and monsters. And as the battle raged, a third force arrived. A single, battered, but instantly recognizable vessel. The Black Templar's Eternal Crusader, flagship of High Marshal Helbrecht. He had followed his instincts, his hunt for Ghazghkull leading him to this final, apocalyptic confrontation. His fleet was small, a fraction of the other two, but it was comprised of the most fanatical and determined warriors in the Imperium. Helbrecht, ignoring the wider naval battle, focused on a single objective. He knew Ghazghkull would be on the attack moon, and he knew that the only way to end this was to do what he had done once before, cut off the head of the snake. He gathered every Terminator, every assault marine, every warrior he had, and prepared for a final, glorious boarding action. His target, the command center of a weaponized moon at the heart of the largest Orc and Necron fleet battle in history. It was a suicide mission, a final, desperate charge worthy of the Templar's creed. No pity, no remorse, no fear, he broadcast to his warriors. For the Emperor and for Yarrick, the assault began. The Templar ships, eschewing caution, plunged directly towards the attack moon, weathering a storm of fire from both Orc and Necron guns. Boarding torpedoes and teleportation beams slammed into the moon's surface, disgorging hundreds of black-clad space marines into the heart of the beast. The fighting inside the moon was even more hellish than the battle outside. They fought through corridors the size of canyons, against hordes of Orcs and malfunctioning Necron scarabs that had also bored their way inside. It was a chaotic, three-way slaughter in the dark, but the Templars pushed ever onward, their goal the moon's command core. Helbrecht himself was at the forefront, his power soared a blur of motion, his every action a prayer to the god Emperor. He knew he was going to die here. But he also knew that he would take the beast with him. And in the cold, silent throne room of his flagship, the Silent King watched the unfolding chaos on his holographic displays. He observed the suicidal charge of the Black Templars, and for the first time in 60 million years, something akin to curiosity flickered in his cold, emotionless mind. These humans, with their irrational courage and their capacity for self-sacrifice, were a variable he had not fully accounted for. They were illogical, inefficient, and yet undeniably effective. He made a decision. He would allow the humans their glorious, pointless charge. He would let them be the scalpel that removed the cancer of Ghazghkull, while his own fleet dealt with the wider orc infection. It was the most logical, efficient use of available resources. And so, the Necron fleet shifted its focus, forming a protective cordon around the attack moon, preventing any other orc forces from interfering with Helbrecht's assault, but also preventing any of the Templars from escaping. It was a quarantine, a sterile field for a surgical operation. Helbrecht and his warriors were now completely alone, trapped on a moon with billions of orcs, their only way out being forward into the lair of the reborn beast himself. The final confrontation was at hand, a battle that would not just decide the fate of Armageddon, but could very well determine the future of the entire galaxy, a future that would either be human, orc, or silent and eternal. Deep within the core of the attack moon, in a vast cavern lit by the geothermal energy of the moon's molten heart, Ghazghkull waited. He sat on a throne carved from the engine of a conquered imperial titan, the air around him thick with the psychic energy of the Warog. He had watched the Necrons arrive. He had watched the Templars board his moon, and he was pleased. This was the battle he had dreamed of, a battle against everyone at once, the ultimate scrap. When Helbrecht and his surviving sword brethren finally breached the throne room, they found him waiting, not alone, but flanked by his new honor guard, a cadre of massive orc meganobs who had been grafted with scavenged Necron technology. Their power claws crackled with Gauss energy, and their iron jaws dripped with black metallic fluid. It was an unholy fusion of brute force and ancient, soulless technology. "Metal boy," Ghazghkull boomed, his new body so large it scraped the roof of the cavern. "You came. I was hoping you would. I got a new body. Wanna see what it can do?" Without another word, he charged. The battle that followed was beyond epic. It was a clash of mythic proportions. Terminator armor was ripped apart by Gauss claws. Necron orcs were cut down by flaming power swords. The very cavern shook with the force of their blows. Helbrecht once again found himself locked in a duel with Ghazghkull, but this time the warboss was a different creature. He was faster, stronger, and his mind was sharper. His movements no longer just brutal, but filled with a terrifying alien cunning. He fought not just like an orc, but like a Necron destroyer lord, his every move calculated for maximum killing efficiency. Helbrecht, for all his skill and faith, was outmatched. Ghazghkull shattered his sword, broke his arm, and slammed him to the ground. He stood over the fallen High Marshal, his massive foot on his chest, a mirror of the scene with Yarrick all those years ago. "It's over, metal boy," Ghazghkull grunted. "This time, no one's coming to save you." But as he raised his claw for the final blow, a strange thing happened. The ground began to shake, not from the battle, but from something deeper, something within the moon itself. A green, ethereal light began to shine from the walls of the cavern, and a low, humming sound filled the air. The Necron technology that had been integrated into the moon and into Ghazghkull's own forces was responding to a new command. From his throne ship, the Silent King had decided that the experiment was over. He had seen enough. The orcs were too unpredictable, their fusion with his technology an abomination that could not be allowed to continue. He activated a hidden command protocol, a master override that would shut down all Necron technology within the moon. The Gauss weapons on Ghazghkull's knobs sputtered and died. The bionic limbs on the warboss himself seized up, his body racked with spasms as the alien technology turned against him. He roared in pain and confusion, his body locked in a state of paralysis. Helbrecht, seeing his chance, ignored his broken bones and surged to his feet. He grabbed the jagged shard of his broken power sword, and with a final, desperate prayer to the Emperor, drove it into the optical sensor of Ghazghkull's right eye. The warboss screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and stumbled backward, crashing into his throne, his body still twitching from the Necron override signal. At that moment, the Silent King made his final move. He focused the energy of his entire fleet's main weapons not on the Ork armada, but on the attack moon itself. A beam of pure, annihilating energy, a light so bright it was like a new star being born, lanced out and struck the moon. There was no explosion, no sound. The moon and everything on it, Ghazghkull, Helbrecht, the Templars, the billions of orks, simply ceased to be. It was erased from existence, a final, surgical removal of a galactic threat. On the surface of Armageddon, the sky, which had been filled with the light of 3 warring fleets, suddenly went dark and silent. The war was over. The planet was saved. But its saviors were gone, sacrificed in a conflict almost too vast for human comprehension. In the aftermath, the galaxy was left to grapple with the consequences. The Ork race was shattered, leaderless, broken into a million warring tribes. The Black Templars had lost their High Marshal and a huge portion of their fighting strength, a blow from which it would take them centuries to recover. And the Necrons, their purpose served, simply vanished back into the darkness between the stars, their motives and their ultimate goals as mysterious as ever. Armageddon, the world that had been the focal point of so much death and destruction, was finally, truly at peace. But it was a peace bought at an unimaginable price, a peace haunted by the ghosts of heroes and monsters, a peace that served as a grim reminder of the true nature of the 41st millennium, a galaxy where survival is the only victory, and where even the greatest of legends can be erased from existence in the blink of a cold, uncaring, mechanical eye. And yet, in the farthest reaches of the galaxy, on a world of scrap and rust, a single grot orderly, sifting through a pile of refuse teleported away from the attack moon in its final moments by a particularly lucky shock attack gun misfire, found something. It was a single, charred metal plate, part of a giant's skull, and from it a faint green light still flickered. The cycle, it seemed, was not quite over. The galaxy had not heard the last of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. For a being like him, death was not an ending, but merely an inconvenience, a temporary setback before the next, even greater Warog. The universe had won a reprieve, but the great green was eternal, and it would, inevitably, rise again. The war for Armageddon was over, but the war for the galaxy was just getting started. This time, however, the Imperium would be without one of its greatest bulwarks, for High Marshal Helbrecht was truly gone, his sacrifice absolute. The Black Templars would elect a new High Marshal, a man named Valerius, who would vow eternal vengeance upon all greenskins, his hatred fueled by the loss of his predecessor. The saga had created new heroes and new hatreds that would fuel the fires of war for centuries to come. The Imperium had survived, but it was weaker, more vulnerable, and facing a future where the old certainties were gone, replaced by a terrifying new reality where ancient alien kings and resurrected orc demigods were the players in a game that dwarfed the concerns of mere mortals. The age of legends was over, and the age of monsters had begun. The people of Armageddon rebuilt, as they always did. The Steel Legion stood guard, as they always would. But a shadow had fallen over their world, and over the galaxy, a shadow that would never truly lift. It was the shadow of a future war, a war that would make all that had come before seem like a mere prelude. And somewhere, in the dark, a green eye flickered open, and a low, guttural laugh echoed in the silence. The game was not over. It was just waiting for the next player to make a move. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war and war. War never changes. Its actors may fall, its stages may crumble to dust, but the bloody performance will always, always continue. The silence in the Armageddon system was profound. The great fleets were gone, the sky was clear of all but the system's natural stars, and the psychic noise of the Warog had vanished. For the first time in over a century, the people of Armageddon knew something resembling peace, but it was a fragile, traumatized peace. The planet was a graveyard, its population decimated, its infrastructure shattered beyond repair. The Imperium, grappling with the new reality of the Noctis Aetna and Robout Guilliman's indomitous crusade, had few resources to spare for a world that had, for all intents and purposes, been saved by Xenos. Armageddon was largely left to fend for itself. The Steel Legion, under the command of a new generation of officers, became the sole authority, their rule martial and grim. They were a people defined by war, and now that the war was over, they were lost. They maintained their vigil, standing guard against an enemy that was no longer there. Their lives and culture so intertwined with the conflict that they could not conceive of an existence without it. The stories of Yarrick, Ghazghkull, and Helbrecht became their new sacred texts, tales told to children to instill in them the virtues of vigilance and sacrifice. The planet became a monument to the war, its ruined hives left as memorials, its people the permanent, living embodiment of the cost of survival. But the galaxy moves on. The Indomitus Crusade pushed back the darkness in other sectors. New heroes rose, new threats emerged. The tale of Armageddon, once the central drama of the Segmentum Solar, became just one story among thousands, a grim footnote in the bloody history of the Dark Imperium. The names that had once shaken the stars became whispers, then legends, then myths. And yet, the universe has a strange sense of irony. The Necron intervention had an unforeseen side effect. The massive energy discharge from the Silent King's fleet had not just destroyed the attack moon. It had momentarily torn a hole in reality, a small, temporary warp rift directly over the planet. And through that rift, something stirred. Not demons, not gods, but an echo. The immense psychic trauma of the billions of deaths, the sheer concentration of faith, rage, and despair had coalesced in the warp. It created something new, a psychic entity born of the planet's long agony. It began as a whisper in the minds of the astropaths, a feeling of being watched. Then came the dreams, shared by millions across the planet. Dreams of a one-eyed old man in a commissar's coat, standing on a wall, his gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting. He never spoke, but his presence was a comfort, a reassurance. He was still on guard. The people of Armageddon began to call him the Saint of the Vigil. They built shrines to him, not of gold and marble, but of shell casings and broken lasguns. He was not a saint of peace or of mercy, but of endless, stubborn, thankless duty. A new faith was born on the ashes of the old, a faith in the eternal soldier, the man who had held the line. Some inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus saw this as a dangerous new cult and called for its suppression. But others, more pragmatic, saw it as a powerful tool. A population unified by a belief in a guardian spirit was a stable, productive population. And so, the cult of Saint Yarrick was allowed to grow, a strange and unique phenomenon in the vast tapestry of the imperial creed. On the other side of the galaxy, the reborn Ghazghkull was also undergoing a transformation. His new body was powerful, but his mind was different. The brief connection to the Necron network had changed him. He was no longer just a creature of instinct and brute force. He had seen glimpses of the cold, silent logic of the Necrons, the vast, cosmic timelines they operated on. He began to think not in terms of battles or even wars, but in terms of epochs. He saw the orc race not as a weapon to be wielded, but as a force of nature to be guided, a tide of green that would one day wash over the galaxy and scour it clean, making way for a new age of pure, uncomplicated existence. The age of Gork and Mork. He was no longer just a warboss. He was a philosopher, a visionary, a true prophet. He began to gather his forces, not with bellows and threats, but with a strange, compelling logic that resonated with the orc psyche. He spoke of a future where there would be no more waiting for a fight, because the whole universe would be one, glorious, endless battle. He was preparing for the final Warag, the Warag, to end all Warags. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him that to achieve this, he needed to resolve the one, final, nagging loose end in his own story. The echo, the ghost, the one-eyed man who still haunted his dreams. He did not know what the Saint of the Vigil was, but he knew it was a part of Yarrick, a part of their shared legend. And he knew that to truly become the undisputed master of the Great Green, he had to confront it. He had to go back. Not for revenge, not for conquest, but for something more profound. He had to go back to Armageddon to kill a ghost. And so, the stage was set for one final bizarre and utterly unexpected chapter in the saga of Armageddon. Not a war of armies and fleets, but a metaphysical conflict between a resurrected orc demigod and the lingering psychic echo of his greatest foe. It would be a war fought not for territory, but for the soul of a planet and the meaning of a legend. A war that would finally, truly, answer the question of who was the greater force in the galaxy, the man who would never stop fighting, or the beast who could never truly die. The psychic presence of the Saint of the Vigil grew stronger with each passing year. It was no longer just a feeling or a dream. It began to have a tangible effect on the world. Steel legionnaires in desperate situations would see a fleeting image of the old commissar at their shoulder, their aim steadying, their fear vanishing. Malfunctioning equipment would roar back to life at a crucial moment. The people of Armageddon came to believe that Yarrick had not truly died, but had ascended, becoming the planet's guardian spirit, his will now an integral part of its very fabric. The Inquisition watched with growing concern. This was bordering on heresy, the creation of a new, unsanctioned saint, but they could not deny its effectiveness. Morale on Armageddon was higher than on any other world in the sector. Production quotas were always met. The planet was a model of imperial resolve. To interfere would be to risk destabilizing one of the few stable worlds in the region. And so they watched, and they waited, unsure of what this new phenomenon would become. Ghazghkull's journey back to Armageddon was a strange one. He did not arrive with a fleet. He arrived alone. Using the advanced teleportation technology he had stolen from Nazdreg and perfected with his new Necron-infused knowledge, he simply appeared, a single, colossal figure materializing in the heart of the ash wastes, the very place where so many of his boys had fallen. His arrival did not go unnoticed. The entire planet seemed to sense his presence. The sky darkened, the wind howled, and a palpable sense of dread fell over the populace. The psychic echo of Yarrick reacted as well. On the walls of Hades' hive, a ghostly figure of the old commissar appeared, more solid and real than ever before, his one good eye staring out into the wastes, as if he knew his old enemy had returned. Ghazghkull began to walk towards Hades' hive. He did not run, he did not charge. He simply walked, a relentless, unstoppable force. The Steel Legion mobilized to meet him. Entire tank companies, regiments of infantry, even the hive's remaining titans, marched out into the wastes to intercept him. They threw everything they had at him. Basilisk shells exploded around him. Lascanon beams seared his armor. Even the volcano cannon of a warlord titan scored a direct hit. But nothing could stop him. His new body, a fusion of orc resilience, mech ingenuity, and Necron living metal, simply regenerated the damage, the wounds sealing themselves as he walked. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a force of nature, an avatar of destruction. He did not fight back. He simply walked through the storm of fire, his single-minded purpose clear. He was not here for the Steel Legion. He was here for the ghost. As he reached the walls of Hades' hive, the spectral form of Yarrick solidified completely. It was no longer just an image. It had substance, a shimmering form of pure psychic energy. It raised a ghostly power claw, its form an exact replica of the one the real Yarrick had carried. The two figures, one of flesh and metal, the other of spirit and memory, faced each other before the gates of the city that had defined them both. Ghazghkull finally stopped. He looked up at the ghost of his old enemy. "One eye," he rumbled, his voice a strange mix of hatred and respect. "I killed you. You should be dead." The ghost of Yarrick did not speak, but a voice echoed in Ghazghkull's mind, a voice of cold, unyielding iron. Duty does not end with death. Ghazghkull let out a roar of frustration and charged. The battle that followed was unlike any other. It was a clash between the physical and the metaphysical. Ghazghkull's blows, which could shatter mountains, passed through the ghost's form with little effect. The ghost's attacks, while insubstantial, struck at Ghazghkull's mind, his soul, forcing him to relive every defeat, every failure, every moment of doubt he had ever had. It was a battle of pure will. The Steel Legion could only watch in stunned silence as the monster they could not scratch fought a ghost they could not touch. The duel raged for a day and a night. Ghazghkull, for all his power, could not destroy the ghost. And the ghost, for all its psychic might, could not break the indomitable will of the orc. It was a perfect stalemate, an eternal conflict between two opposing forces. But Ghazghkull, with his new, enhanced intellect, began to understand. He could not win by fighting. The ghost was not a person, it was an idea, a memory, a legend. And you cannot kill a legend with a chopper. He stopped fighting. He stood before the ghost, his massive frame heaving. "You win, One Eye," he grunted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You beat me. You'll always beat me here. This is your world, your legend." The ghost of Yarrick lowered its weapon. The voice in Ghazghkull's mind softened. "This world is a tomb, a monument to a war that should have ended long ago. It is holding us both back." Ghazghkull looked at the hive, at the soldiers on the walls, at the world that had been the sole focus of his existence for so long. And for the first time, he saw it not as a prize, but as a cage. A cage for him, and a cage for the memory of his greatest enemy. "What do we do then?" Ghazghkull asked, the question sounding strange even to himself. The ghost of Yarrick pointed out, away from Armageddon, towards the distant stars. "The galaxy is vast. There are other wars to be fought, other legends to be made. Our story is over. It is time for a new one." Ghazghkull looked at the ghost and then at the stars, and he understood. He turned his back on Hades' hive, on Armageddon, on the ghost of Sebastian Yarrick. He began to walk back into the wastes, his purpose no longer tied to this one single world. He was free. As he walked, the ghost of Yarrick began to fade. Its duty was done. The threat was gone. The vigil was over. The figure shimmered, grew translucent, and then vanished, leaving only the silent walls of the hive and the memory of a man who had become a legend. The people of Armageddon saw their saint disappear, and they did not mourn. They understood that the war was finally, truly over. Ghazghkull teleported away from Armageddon, his mind clear for the first time in centuries. He no longer needed to prove himself against Yarrick. He had accepted that their legend was a part of him, but it did not define him. He was ready to begin his true work. He was ready to unite the orc race, not for revenge, not for a single personal grudge, but for the glorious, galaxy-spanning Warog. That was their birthright. The saga of Armageddon was over, but the saga of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of Gork and Mork, the true beast, had just begun. And the galaxy, which had thought itself safe, was about to learn the true meaning of fear, for the monster was no longer haunted by the ghost of the past. He was now free to create a future of his own making, a future of endless, glorious, all-consuming war, a future that was, and always would be, completely and utterly green. The psychic backlash of the saints' final dissolution was immense. It washed over the planet not as a destructive force, but as a wave of profound finality, a collective sigh of relief from a world that had been holding its breath for generations. The people of Armageddon felt the change immediately. The grim, oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the planet for centuries lifted. For the first time, they felt not just safe, but at peace. The cult of the vigil faded, not through persecution, but through obsolescence. The ghost was gone because he was no longer needed. The people began to rebuild their world, not as a fortress, but as a home. The story of Yarrick was still told, but now it was a history lesson, not a prayer. The Imperium, seeing the shift, began to reinvest in the world, its strategic importance as a manufacturing hub now outweighing its history as a war zone. Armageddon began to prosper, its scars slowly healing, its future finally its own. And what of Ghazghkull? He returned to his burgeoning empire, a changed orc. The rage and spite that had driven him were gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He called a grand council of all the major orc warbosses, a gathering of the most powerful greenskins in the galaxy. He did not challenge them, he did not threaten them, he spoke to them. He told them of his vision of a united orc race, of a warg that would not just conquer but remake the galaxy. He spoke of the weaknesses of the imperium, the treachery of chaos, the hunger of the tyrannids, and the cold silence of the necrons. He told them that the orcs were the true masters of the universe, and it was time they started acting like it. His words, infused with the power of his immense psychic presence and the clarity of his newfound purpose, resonated with them. The war bosses, who had come ready for a fight, found themselves listening, nodding, and for the first time in their history, agreeing. They hailed him not just as their leader, but as the Gork Mork, the living embodiment of their gods. The great Warag was no longer just an army, it was a crusade, a holy war, and its target was not a single world or even a single sector. Its target was everything. The story of Armageddon thus serves as a strange and unexpected prologue. It is the story of how the galaxy's greatest threat was forged, not in victory, but in defeat, not in hatred, but in a grudging, galaxy-spanning respect. It is the story of how a man became a ghost, and how that ghost taught a monster how to be a god. The final, true war for the galaxy would not be fought on Armageddon, it would be fought everywhere. And it would be a war that the Imperium, for all its might not be able to win. For it would be a war not against a simple beast, but against a thinking, learning, evolving idea, an idea that was green and mean, and was now coming for them all, its path cleared of all ghosts and all doubts. The age of Armageddon was over. The age of the orc was about to begin. The final lesson of the long wars was a terrifying one. Sometimes, to create a god, you first have to create a devil worthy of fighting him. And sometimes, the only way to save one world is to accidentally unleash a threat that could doom a million more. The law of unintended consequences is the only true law in the 41st millennium, a lesson that the battered survivors of Armageddon now understood all too well as they looked to the stars and wondered what new horrors their long and bloody history had just unleashed upon the unsuspecting galaxy. The first target of the newly unified orc race was a surprise to all. They did not strike at Terra or at Cadia or at any of the great fortresses of the Imperium. They struck at the eye of terror itself. Ghazghkull, with his newfound strategic insight, understood that the greatest long-term threat to his vision was not the decaying Imperium, but the anarchic, unpredictable nature of chaos. He saw the Great Rift as a wound in reality that needed to be cleansed, not with faith or with order, but with the sheer, overwhelming power of the Warag. His massive fleet, led by the newly christened attack planet, Gork's Fist, plunged into the heart of the warp storm. The forces of chaos, who had long considered the orcs to be a minor, amusing nuisance, were caught completely by surprise. On the demon world of Sicarus, the legions of a cornate demon prince were overrun and slaughtered by a tide of green that seemed immune to fear and rage. On the pleasure planet of Shardom, the followers of Slanesh found their exquisite sensations drowned out by the deafening roar of orc engines and the stench of Prometheum. The orcs were a force of pure, primal reality, and their presence in the warp was like a fist of cold iron plunging into a fever dream. The chaos gods themselves were enraged. This was an intrusion, a violation. They turned their full attention to this new threat, dispatching their greatest champions and their most powerful demonic legions to destroy the greenskin interlopers. And so began a new, bizarre, and utterly brutal front in the eternal war. The War in the Rift, a conflict that saw the primal fury of the orcs pitted against the insidious corruption of chaos. It was a war that neither side was prepared for, and a war that would have profound and unforeseen consequences for the entire galaxy. The Imperium, watching from the sidelines, was both relieved and terrified. Relieved that two of its greatest enemies were now focused on destroying each other, and terrified of what might emerge victorious from that titanic, unholy conflict. The long peace of Armageddon had been bought at a terrible price, a price that the entire galaxy would now have to pay. The old war was over, but a new, stranger, and far more dangerous war had just begun. A war that would be fought in the twisted, unreal landscapes of the warp. A war that would redefine the very nature of the galactic struggle for survival. And all of it, every last drop of blood and every shattered soul, could be traced back to a single, stubborn, one-eyed old man who had simply refused to give up, and in doing so, had changed the course of history in ways no one could have ever imagined. His legend was complete, but the consequences of his actions were now a burden for a galaxy that was already on the brink of collapse. The final irony was the most bitter of all. In his desperate quest to save humanity, Sebastian Yarrick may have ultimately doomed it.